When my son, Darren, called me that evening, his voice carried the same soft tone he always used when he needed something. "Mom," he said, "I've got bad news. The family vacation, we'll have to cancel. Finances are a little tight right now." His words sank into me like a slow drizzle, familiar and oddly soothing. I wanted to believe him, just like I always did. I had been looking forward to that trip for months. Matching suitcases stacked in the hallway, new sandals still in their boxes, and a fresh passport cover I'd bought online with my name engraved in gold. The thought of standing on white sand with my grandkids, of watching the sunset together, had been the one thing keeping me cheerful through the long, lonely summer. But when Darren spoke, I heard a strain in his voice, and I mistook it for stress. "That's okay, sweetheart," I told him gently. "We can always go another time." I smiled into the phone, even though no one could see it. He exhaled with relief and thanked me for understanding, just before hanging up. I sat on the edge of my bed for a long time after that call, staring at the half-packed luggage, at the bright yellow sun hat I'd bought for the trip. A small ache settled somewhere between my ribs. I told myself they must be struggling. Inflation, bills, the kids' school fees. It all made sense. Darren had a good heart, I thought. He'd never intentionally hurt me. I spent the next few weeks throwing myself into work at the local community center, picking up extra shifts just to keep busy. The volunteers often told me I worked too hard for my age, but what they didn't know was that work kept the loneliness quiet. Ever since my husband, Howard, passed away, the house had grown still, too large, too full of echoes. Darren and his family were my heartbeat in that silence. Helping them financially, even when it stretched me thin, made me feel needed, still part of their world. 3 weeks later, everything changed with a single swipe of my thumb. I was sitting on the couch, tea in hand, scrolling through Facebook when a familiar name popped up. Chantel Moore added 12 new photos. That was my daughter-in-law. I capped the album without thinking, and then froze. The first image was bright and golden, the kind of picture travel magazines use to sell dreams. The ocean glittered under a Caribbean sun, waves curling like silk ribbons. And there, right in the center, was my son, Darren, dressed in a crisp white linen shirt, smiling so wide his teeth caught the light. Beside him, Chantel posed in a coral dress that screamed money, diamonds glinting on her neck, a champagne glass raised high. Around them stood my grandkids, Jamal and Nia, wearing matching straw hats with embroidered initials. Even Chantel's parents, the wealthy couple I'd met twice at awkward family dinners, were there too. I felt my stomach drop. I scrolled through the photos in silence, one by one, each more painful than the last. There was a family dinner under string lights, a group photo by the ship's railing, my son, laughing, sunburned, carefree, surrounded by everyone he called family. Everyone except me. The caption under the final photo read, "Unforgettable family vacation, blessed beyond words." My eyes stuck to that one word, unforgettable. It twisted inside me like a rusted nail. The room suddenly felt smaller, the air thicker. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears. My tea had gone cold. I didn't cry. Not yet. I didn't yell or text or call. I just sat there, staring at the smiling faces of people who had lied to me. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every memory of Darren as a little boy replayed like a cruel film. His first bicycle, his graduation, the day he cried at his father's funeral and promised he'd always look after me. And now, here we were. He was toasting with champagne while I sat in my quiet kitchen, counting coins to cover his old credit card bill that I had foolishly agreed to co-sign. I had spent years believing I was helping him get back on his feet, but maybe I had been the one kneeling the whole time. The following morning, I went about my day pretending nothing had happened. That's what mothers do. We carry heartbreaks like invisible weights and keep moving. I watered the garden, chatted with my neighbor, even laughed at something on TV. But inside, something had shifted. Something sharp had lodged itself deep within me. For 72 years, I had lived my life for others. My husband, my child, my grandchildren. I poured out every ounce of love and money I had. And now, staring at those pictures, I realized love wasn't supposed to feel like debt. Still, I stayed silent. I didn't tell anyone. Not yet. Instead, I started watching more closely, noticing the little things I'd ignored for years, like the way Darren always called when he needed money, but never just to ask how I was doing. The way Chantel sent overly sweet messages right before some new emergency. I saw it all now. Every manipulation, every guilt trip, every subtle reminder that I was lucky to still be part of their plans. I had mistaken dependence for love and generosity for connection. But something inside me was waking up. The same strength I once used to raise Darren alone after his father's illness, that quiet, stubborn fire, began to stir again. I didn't know it yet, but this discovery, this betrayal, was about to become my liberation. Because in the coming weeks, one text, just one short message, would undo years of guilt and set me free in a way I never imagined possible. 3 weeks passed after that discovery, and though my days looked the same on the outside, I felt like a stranger in my own life. Every morning, I brewed my coffee and sat by the window watching the sun climb through the clouds, but even that soft light felt different now, colder, distant. The truth had cracked something open in me. I started counting, not days or hours, but memories of every sacrifice I had made for Darren. The nights I stayed up wiring money to help with his rent, the time I dipped into my savings so his children could attend private school, the car I sold to help them move into a better neighborhood. Each act of love had been given freely, without expectation. Or so I told myself. But the more I replayed the past, the more I realized how one-sided it had always been. My generosity had become their habit, my kindness their crutch. They didn't see me as a mother anymore. I had become a safety net, invisible until needed. Then, one ordinary morning, my phone vibrated on the counter. A familiar name flashed on the screen. Darren. My heart, still soft despite everything, gave a small, hopeful flutter. Maybe he was calling to apologize, I thought. Maybe he'd tell me it was a misunderstanding, that they had planned to surprise me, that I was supposed to be there, that they missed me terribly. I reached for the phone, already rehearsing forgiveness in my mind. But when I opened the message, the words hit me like ice water. Mom, I urgently need $7,500. My card got maxed, and Chantel's parents can't help right now. I'll pay you back next month. I read it twice, then a third time. Every word felt heavier than the last. Urgent. Can't help. Next month. It was the same language, the same pattern, the same endless cycle that had defined our relationship for nearly a decade. My hand trembled as I held the phone, not from anger, but from clarity. For the first time, I saw the truth unblurred. They had never planned to include me. They had canceled our trip so they could take theirs without me, using the same money I once given to help them move. The kettle whistled behind me, and I didn't move. I just stared at the message until the steam fogged the kitchen window. I thought of every moment I'd said yes, even when my heart said no. Every time I'd told myself it was just helping my family. And now here it was again. Another request, another demand wrapped in urgency and guilt. But something inside me whispered, not this time. I typed slowly, my fingers hovering over the screen. Only 4 words came out, quiet and final. Ask your wife's family. I stared at that line for a long time before hitting send. It was the shortest message I had ever written to my son, and the most powerful. I didn't add an explanation, not a single extra word. I didn't apologize or justify. I simply pressed send and placed the phone face down on the counter. At first, the silence that followed felt suffocating. My heart raced, my palms were damp, and a wave of guilt surged through me. The kind of guilt only mothers know, that instinctive pull to fix, to soothe, to sacrifice. For a brief second, I almost grabbed the phone to take it all back. But then I remembered those photographs. The laughter, the champagne, the family dinner I wasn't invited to. I remembered the way unforgettable had carved itself into my chest like a scar, and I let the silence hold me. Within minutes, the phone began to buzz. First a call, then another, then message after message. 17 missed calls in total before noon. Darren's name kept flashing on the screen, alternating with Chantel's. I didn't answer any of them. I stood by the window, watching the leaves tremble in the wind, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel trapped. My hands were shaking, but it wasn't fear this time. It was release. Later that day, a long message came through from Chantel. Paragraphs filled with soft excuses and tangled words. It's not what it looks like. We didn't want to upset you. You know how Darren gets. I read the first few lines, then scrolled to the end. She'd written, "We love you, Mom. Please don't be angry." I deleted it without replying. That afternoon, I did something I had been too scared to do for years. I put on my blue cardigan, the one Howard had always said made me look peaceful, and I walked to the bank. My steps felt heavier than usual, but there was a strange rhythm to them, a quiet certainty. At the counter, I asked the clerk to close every joint account I shared with Darren. I canceled the extra debit cards in their names and stopped all the automatic transfers that had been draining my pension for years. The woman behind the counter looked at me kindly, as if she knew this wasn't just paperwork, it was emancipation. When she printed the confirmation slip, I folded it carefully and slipped it into my wallet like a victory medal. As I walked home, the air felt lighter, the sky clearer. I realized I was breathing differently, slower, deeper, like someone who had been underwater for too long and finally surfaced. Every sound seemed sharper. The rustle of trees, the distant laughter of children, the steady rhythm of my own footsteps. Freedom didn't arrive with fireworks. It came quietly, in the form of a text message unsent, a call unanswered, a decision finally made. That evening, as the sunset painted the sky in streaks of gold and rose, I sat on my porch with a cup of tea. My phone lay silent beside me. For once, there were no notifications, no demands, no guilt. Just the hum of crickets and the soft clink of my spoon against the cup. It felt strange at first, peaceful, but almost unfamiliar. I had spent so many years mistaking exhaustion for love that calmness felt foreign. But as the night deepened, I realized something beautiful. This silence wasn't loneliness. It was space. Space I had finally made for myself. To understand how I reached that moment, that four-word rebellion that rewrote my life, you'd have to know where it all began. Because things like this don't happen overnight. They build slowly, quietly, like rainwater seeping into the cracks of a house until one day the foundation gives way. My story didn't start with betrayal. It started with love, deep, consuming, and unconditional love for a boy I raised alone after losing the only man who ever truly saw me. My husband, Howard, passed away 8 years ago. He was a quiet man, steady as the dawn. He worked 30 years at the same factory, never once late, never once complaining. When cancer took him, it was as if the color drained from the world. The morning after his funeral, I sat on our bed, surrounded by folded clothes that still smelled like his cologne, and I remember thinking, what now? After 50 years of being a wife and mother, I didn't know who I was without someone to care for. Darren was my only child. He was 45 at the time, with a family of his own. Chantel, his wife, and their 2 kids. I told myself he didn't need me anymore, but I was wrong. Or maybe I just needed him to need me. That first year after Howard's death, Darren came around more often. At first, it was comforting. He'd sit in the same armchair his father used to occupy, flipping through old photo albums, making me laugh with stories about the kids. He was my lifeline back to the world. But soon, the visits started to change. There were sighs, long pauses, and then little requests. Small things at first. "Mom, can I borrow a little until payday? Mom, the school fees came up all at once. Mom, we're short on the mortgage this month." Every time he asked, I told myself it was temporary. He was my son, after all. I couldn't bear to see him struggle. When I wrote that first check, I didn't think much of it. But 1 check turned into 2, 2 turned into 10, and before long, I wasn't just helping, I was funding their lives. Birthdays, car payments, new appliances, emergencies that seemed to appear every few weeks. I dipped into my savings, the same savings Howard and I had built for our retirement, telling myself I'd replenish it later. But later never came. When Darren lost his job for a few months, I helped cover their expenses. When Chantel wanted to start an online boutique, I gave her seed money. When their credit card debt grew too heavy, I consolidated it under my own name. It was never one big leap. It was hundreds of tiny steps, each disguised as love. Looking back now, I can see how cleverly guilt wrapped itself around every transaction. Darren never demanded. He asked softly. That was his gift. His voice always trembled just enough to make me feel needed, to make me feel like I was the only one standing between him and disaster. "You've always been my rock, Mom," he'd say, and my heart would melt. I didn't realize that those words, sweet as they sounded, were slowly becoming chains. Because when you're a mother, you're taught that sacrifice is proof of love. You give until it hurts, and when it hurts, you give more. Then came the joint accounts. "It'll be easier for emergencies," he'd said. I remember sitting in that bank, signing papers with his arm draped casually over my shoulder, feeling proud that I could still help. I didn't notice how easily he memorized my PIN, or how Chantel smiled politely as if it were already decided. I didn't see the danger in turning over the small routines of my life, the finances, the decisions, to the people I trusted most. When you grow older, you stop imagining betrayal. You think the only thieves you'll meet are time and illness, but sometimes the ones you love most take from you the things you don't even realize you're losing. For a long time, I told myself it was fine. I had my pension, my paid-off house, my quiet little garden. I told myself family meant sharing everything, even burdens. And yet, deep down, I think I knew. There were small moments, fleeting, almost invisible, that whispered the truth before I was ready to hear it. Like the time I overheard Chantel's sigh about how Grandma always has it covered, or the way Darren's tone shifted from gratitude to expectation. There were times I'd suggest meeting for dinner, and he'd say, "Sure, Mom, you don't mind picking up the check, right?" It was always said with a smile, so casual, so light, but every smile chipped a little more off the mother I used to be. I began to disappear into the role they needed me to play. The helper, the banker, the fixer. I'd open my wallet before they even finished asking, hoping it would buy their affection, their presence. I see that now, how love and dependency got tangled into something toxic. The irony is, I never cared about the money itself. $80,000, it wasn't just cash. It was my time, my energy, my security. It was all the small dreams I'd quietly buried. The art class I never joined, the trip I never took with my girlfriends, the home repairs I kept postponing because the kids need it more. Howard once told me, "Ruby, don't ever let your kindness become your cage." I didn't understand him then. I do now. Because every check I wrote, every transfer I approved, I was building the bars myself, thinking it was love, when really it was fear. Fear of being alone. Fear that if I said no, they'd stop calling, stop visiting, stop needing me. And when you've built your entire identity around being needed, the thought of being forgotten is unbearable. By the time I realized how deep I'd sunk, I was too far in. The accounts were shared, the expectations set. I was the family bank. No interest, no boundaries, and no escape. That's why when I saw those cruise pictures, the laughter, the glow of the sun on their faces, it wasn't just the trip that broke me. It was the realization that my sacrifice had bought their happiness, not our togetherness, that I had funded my own exclusion. But sometimes pain has a strange way of waking you up. That day, sitting in the dim light of my living room, I finally saw the story I'd been living, not as a loving mother helping her struggling son, but as a woman trapped by her own goodness. And for the first time in years, I began to imagine something different, a version of me who didn't apologize for existing, who didn't measure her worth by how much she gave. I wasn't there yet, not fully, but that spark, that small thought of freedom, had begun to flicker. The morning after I froze the accounts, the world felt strangely quiet, almost too quiet. I remember waking up before dawn, as usual, my body still following the rhythm of habit. I brewed coffee the same way I always had, but when I sat at the kitchen table, the silence was thick, heavy. There were no buzzing phones, no text messages from Darren saying, "Mom, can you transfer it today?" No little emergencies disguised as affection. For a moment, I didn't know what to do with myself. It was as if I had stepped out of a long, noisy storm and into stillness so sharp it stung. I half expected the guilt to crush me, but instead, something else settled in its place. A lightness. Faint, fragile, but real. Still, that first week was hell. Darren called, of course. The first call came that evening. His voice was clipped, pretending to be calm. "Mom, I noticed the account's frozen. Is everything okay?" I told him simply, yes, I needed to make some changes. There was a pause, long enough to tell me he understood what kind of change I meant. Then came the disappointment, the hurt tone, the practiced guilt. "Mom, we were counting on that money. You know we've got bills, and the kids—" I stopped him before he could finish. My heart was pounding so hard, I could feel it in my throat. "Darren," I said softly, "you'll figure it out. You always do." The silence that followed was the longest I'd ever endured from him. It stretched for weeks. No calls, no texts. I'd hear updates through neighbors or Facebook posts. That's when I saw it. The subtle shift from concern to resentment. A post from Chantel about learning who really supports you when times get hard. A photo of them at a family dinner, my chair at the table conspicuously empty. It hurt, of course it did. The kind of hurt that doesn't just sting your heart, but your identity. For so long, I had been the mother who provided. Without that role, who was I? But grief, I've learned, isn't always about people who die. Sometimes it's about losing versions of yourself, the ones you created to make others comfortable. Every morning, I'd take long walks through the park just to feel grounded. I'd watch young mothers with strollers, couples laughing on benches, old men feeding birds. For the first time in years, I wasn't rushing anywhere. I wasn't on anyone's schedule but my own. It felt foreign at first, like trying on a stranger's coat, too big, too new. But slowly, that coat started to fit. I began noticing small things again. The way the sunlight filtered through the oak trees near my porch. The soft hum of the neighbor's radio. I started cooking for one. Not out of sadness, but intention. Real meals, not leftovers reheated out of habit. I bought myself flowers for the kitchen counter. I even signed up for a watercolor class at the community center, something I'd wanted to do since Howard passed. It was there, surrounded by women my age and younger ones just beginning to chase their dreams, that I felt something stir inside me, something I hadn't felt in years. Curiosity. At first, I kept to myself. While others painted soft landscapes or bright florals, my hands hesitated over the blank page. My instructor, a gentle woman named Elaine, said, "You don't have to know what to paint. Just start with color." So I did. I painted in shades of blue and gray at first, the colors of loss, of quiet. Then one day I added yellow. It surprised me. The brightness looked strange against all that shadow, but I couldn't stop staring at it. Elaine smiled when she saw. She said, "That's your light." I didn't understand what she meant until weeks later, because somewhere between those classes, the park walks, and the quiet meals, I started to breathe differently. The heaviness that had lived in my chest began to lift, piece by piece. I realized that I didn't miss Darren's constant requests. I missed the illusion of being needed. That was a hard truth to swallow. For decades, I had tied my worth to what I could give, but now there was nothing left to give but time, my own time, and I was learning how precious that was. One afternoon, while cleaning out the attic, I found a box of old journals from my 20s and 30s. I sat on the floor, flipping through pages filled with dreams I had long forgotten, traveling to Italy, learning photography, starting a small bakery with my friend Lydia. It struck me how much of myself I had abandoned in the pursuit of being everything for everyone else. The tears came then, slow and steady. But for once, they weren't tears of regret. They were cleansing, like finally washing the dust off parts of my soul that had been buried too long. Then one night, as I was closing my curtains, I saw my reflection in the window. The faint outline of a woman, older, yes, but also freer. My hair had more gray, my eyes had more truth. I whispered to my reflection, "You're still here." It felt strange speaking to myself with kindness, but I meant it. For the first time in years, I wasn't defined by anyone's expectations but my own. Of course, the loneliness didn't vanish overnight. There were nights when the silence stretched too long, when I'd reach for my phone out of habit, only to remind myself that I didn't owe anyone an apology for protecting my peace. But each time I resisted, I grew a little stronger. Each morning I woke up without checking my bank balance to see who'd taken what. That was freedom. Not the dramatic, cinematic kind, but the quiet, dignified kind. Freedom doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers. It arrives in small moments. The first sip of coffee without anxiety. The first laugh that isn't forced. The first night's sleep that doesn't end in worry. And that's when I realized something profound. Cutting $80,000 didn't just save my finances, it saved my life. It wasn't about money. It was about reclaiming ownership of my time, my emotions, my story. I had given away pieces of myself for decades, thinking love meant sacrifice. But love, real love, shouldn't cost your peace. And as I stood there one morning, coffee in hand, sunlight spilling over my small, quiet kitchen, I thought of Howard again. "Don't let your kindness become your cage," he'd said. I smiled softly. Maybe I was finally learning how to live outside of it. It had been almost 4 quiet months since I cut Darren off, when the knock came at my door. It was a Saturday morning, bright but chilly, the kind of day when the air smells like fresh beginnings. I had just finished watering the plants when I heard the faint tap, 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 hesitant, uncertain. My heart skipped. Somehow I knew before I even looked through the window that it was him. Darren stood on the porch, hands in his pockets, eyes heavy with something that looked like guilt, or maybe exhaustion. For a brief second, my mother's instinct flared again, that reflexive urge to open the door and ask, "Are you okay, baby?" But I didn't. Not right away. I stood there, hidden behind the curtain, watching him the way one studies a stranger. When I finally opened the door, he forced a smile, one that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Hey, Mom," he said softly. His voice cracked a little. "Can we talk?" I nodded, stepping aside. He walked in slowly, looking around as if searching for traces of the life he once owned, the things my money had maintained. The house was cleaner now, simpler, stripped of the chaos his visits used to bring. He sat on the couch, the same couch where he once convinced me to write checks with trembling hands. It felt like a circle closing. He started with small talk, how work had been slow, how the kids were growing, how Chantel's parents had been distant lately. I nodded politely, letting him speak, but I could sense the tension building under the surface, the storm he was dancing around. And then it came, just as I knew it would. "Mom," he sighed, "I hate to even ask, but things have been rough. We're behind on the mortgage. I just need a little help to get through this month." Those words, "a little help," used to be my undoing. I could still remember all the times I had melted at that phrase, all the times I'd convinced myself it was just temporary. But this time, I didn't feel guilt or pity. I felt clarity. I folded my hands and looked him straight in the eye. "Darren, you and I need to talk about what help really means." He blinked, confused. "Mom, this isn't about—" I cut him off gently. "No, it is. For years, I thought helping meant saving you from every consequence. But I see now that wasn't helping, that was enabling." He sat back, the mask slipping. His expression hardened. "So this is it? You're done being my mother?" His tone had sharp edges now, meant to wound. It used to work. Those words used to cut deep, but now they only echoed, hollow. "No, Darren," I said quietly. "I'm just finally being one." The room went still. For a moment, he didn't know what to say. Then came the anger. "Chantel was right. You've changed. You're cold now. Dad would have never let this happen." My breath caught. The mention of Howard hit like a slap, but instead of breaking me, it steeled me. "Your father would have wanted you to stand on your own 2 feet," I said firmly. "He worked hard so you'd learn responsibility, not dependency." Darren stood up, pacing. "You don't understand what it's like, Mom. The bills, the pressure." His voice cracked under the weight of frustration. I looked at him, really looked at him, my grown son, nearly 50, still blaming the world for his choices. "I do understand," I said softly, "because I lived my whole life carrying other people's weight, and I can't do it anymore." He stopped pacing and stared at me, eyes glassy with anger or maybe shame. "So that's it? After everything I've done for you?" I almost laughed at the irony, but the sadness was too heavy. "You mean after everything I've done for you," I corrected. "The roof over your head when you lost your job? The tuition I paid for your kids? The car I bought when yours broke down? I did all that because I love you, but love shouldn't cost me my peace." He didn't answer. Instead, he looked at me with something I hadn't seen in years. Uncertainty. Maybe, just maybe, a flicker of realization. But before it could settle, he shook his head and turned toward the door. "Fine. Don't worry, we'll figure it out without you." He slammed the door behind him, and the echo lingered in the quiet room. For a long time, I just stood there, staring at the door, my chest tight with a mix of sorrow and relief. It's a strange thing, losing someone who's still alive. You grieve the connection, even as you celebrate the freedom. Tears welled up in my eyes, not because of regret, but because of release. That night, I cried for the years I had spent believing that love and sacrifice were the same thing. I cried for the woman who once measured her worth by how much she could give away. Days passed, then weeks. No calls, no messages. I found myself checking my phone less and less. The silence, once unbearable, became peaceful. I filled my time with painting, reading, volunteering at the local food bank.
I met people who didn't see me as a provider or a resource. They saw me as Ruby. Just Ruby. One afternoon at the food bank, I met a woman named Clara. Mid-50s, warm smile, the kind of person who carried light wherever she went. She told me she'd lost her entire savings helping her son's failed business. She thought I was doing the right thing, but sometimes love blinds us to what's destroying us. I nodded, feeling every word. We became fast friends, sharing stories, laughter, and something rare, understanding without judgment. Through her, I realized that my story wasn't unique. So many parents, especially mothers, are quietly draining themselves dry in the name of love. Society called it devotion. I now called it self-erasure. And in that realization, I found purpose. Maybe my pain could serve as a mirror for others still trapped in that cycle. One night, I wrote in my journal, "Freedom isn't about money. It's about boundaries. It's the courage to say no, even when your heart wants to say yes." I went to bed that night lighter than I'd been in years. The air felt cleaner, the world wider. Darren might not have understood it yet, but I knew one day he would. Maybe not soon, maybe not ever, but I had finally given both of us the greatest gift a mother can give her child, the chance to grow up.
The weeks after Darren's visit felt like stepping into a new world, one that looked familiar but somehow felt entirely different. I moved through my days with a quiet rhythm, a kind of peace that didn't rely on anyone's approval. For so long, I had been a woman reacting to others, to their needs, their disappointments, their emergencies. Now I was simply being. Each sunrise wasn't the start of another round of sacrifices. It was an invitation to live, to breathe, to feel. I started to wake up early, not out of worry, but to watch the first light touch the garden. I'd sit with a cup of tea, listening to the world waking up, and for the first time in decades, I felt like I belonged to myself. It was strange at first, this quiet life. There were moments when the stillness felt too big, when my fingers itched to check my phone or make a call just to hear Darren's voice. But I knew what that really was. Not love, but habit. I had been addicted to giving, to fixing, to feeling useful. Letting go of that addiction was its own kind of withdrawal. There were days when I'd stand in the grocery aisle, reaching for something Darren liked, coffee beans, cereal, his favorite barbecue sauce, only to remind myself that I didn't need to buy it anymore. Each time, I'd smile softly and put it back, like closing a chapter gently instead of tearing it out. One evening, I went for a walk along the pier. The sky was painted with streaks of gold and pink, and the air smelled of salt and new beginnings. I saw couples holding hands, kids chasing pigeons, and old friends laughing over paper cups of chowder. I sat on a bench and watched the waves crash, rhythmic and endless. There was something soothing about their certainty. They didn't need permission to move. They just did. For the first time, I allowed myself to imagine what my next tide could bring. That same week, Clara, the woman from the food bank, invited me to a community dinner. "You'll love it," she said. "No speeches, no formality, just people, food, and music." I hesitated at first. For years, social gatherings had meant showing up as the dutiful mother, the widow, the quiet provider. But Clara's warmth was disarming. So I said yes. The dinner was held in a small park lit by string lights. There were tables covered with mismatched cloths, plates of homemade dishes, and a small band playing soft jazz in the corner. The air buzzed with laughter and stories. I sat among strangers who treated me like an equal, not a background character. For once, I wasn't someone's mother, someone's widow, someone's bank. I was just Ruby, a woman who loved cornbread and old music.
As the night went on, someone asked me to dance. His name was Leonard, a retired teacher with kind eyes and a laugh that came easy. "Come on," he said, extending his hand. "You look like you've been waiting to smile." I laughed, shaking my head, but he didn't let down. So I stood up, awkward at first, then later as the music carried me. My feet remembered how to move. My heart remembered how to feel joy without fear. When the song ended, I was breathless. Not from the dance, but from the realization that I was still capable of happiness. That night, lying in bed, I thought about how love changes form. It doesn't die when you stop giving endlessly. It transforms when you start giving to yourself. For so long, I had poured my love outward thinking it would return in the same measure, but now I was learning to let it circulate inward, filling the empty spaces I'd ignored. The next morning, I woke up humming. I painted sunflowers, bold, golden, alive, the opposite of the gray landscapes I'd started with months ago. Elaine, my instructor, smiled when she saw it. "You're blooming," she said, and I believed her. With my newfound confidence, I began saying yes to things I'd once dismissed. A friend at the community center encouraged me to display my paintings at a local craft fair. "People will love them," she said. I laughed nervously, but agreed. On the day of the fair, as I stood behind my small table filled with colors and stories, strangers stopped to admire my work. One woman pointed to a painting of a sunrise and said, "There's peace in this. Did you paint it from a real place?" I smiled. "Yes," I said softly, "from my kitchen window." That sale wasn't just about art. It was validation. Proof that something I created for me could touch someone else. For decades, I had believed my value came from what I gave others. Now, I was seeing that my worth had always been there, waiting quietly beneath the noise. Of course, not every day was perfect. There were nights when the loneliness returned, whispering what-ifs in my ear. I'd wonder if Darren thought of me, if the kids missed me, if I had been too harsh. But each time doubt crept in, I'd remind myself, protecting my peace wasn't cruelty, it was clarity. Love without boundaries isn't love, it's surrender. As months passed, I started journaling again, not about pain this time, but about gratitude. Gratitude for the stillness, the strength, the rediscovery. Gratitude for learning that age doesn't mean the end of growth. Sometimes it's just the beginning. Then one afternoon, I got a letter. An actual letter, not a text or an email. The handwriting was unmistakably Darren's. My hands trembled as I opened it. Inside, there were only a few lines. "Mom, I don't know how to say this, but I get it now. I see what you meant. I'm sorry for everything. I hope you're okay. Love, Darren." I read it 3 times. Tears blurred the ink. It wasn't a full reconciliation, but it was something. A seed of accountability, the first I'd ever seen from him. And that was enough. That night, I placed the letter in my journal and whispered a quiet thank you to the universe. Not for the apology, but for the journey that led me to a place where I didn't need one to feel whole.
It was almost a full year since I had last seen Darren when the phone rang one rainy evening. I was curled up on the couch, reading a book, the soft drumming of rain against the windows filling the room. When I saw the name flash across the screen, Chantel, my heart stuttered. For a long moment, I just stared at it, the past pressing against my chest. A part of me wanted to ignore it, to let the call fade into silence. But curiosity, or maybe something deeper, made me swipe to answer. "Hello?" My voice was calm, steadier than I expected. There was a pause on the other end. Then a shaky voice said, "Mrs. Walker, it's Chantel." She sounded different, smaller, uncertain. "I'm sorry to bother you, but Darren's in the hospital." The words hit me like a wave. My breath caught. "What happened?" I asked. She explained quickly. A minor heart attack, stress-related, nothing fatal but serious enough to scare them. My first instinct was pure maternal panic. Images of him as a little boy flashed in my mind. Scraped knees, his laugh, the way he'd cling to my hand when thunder scared him. That reflex to run to him came alive in me instantly. But then another voice, quieter but stronger, whispered, "Remember the cost of losing yourself." "Which hospital?" I asked. She told me, and I thanked her before hanging up. I sat there for a long time, the phone heavy in my hand, wrestling with two truths: the mother who wanted to rush to his side, and the woman who had finally learned to stand alone. The rain outside grew heavier, streaking the windows with silver trails, as if the sky itself was undecided on how much to let go. The next morning, I drove to the hospital. My heart thudded as I walked through the sterile white corridors, the smell of disinfectant and fear thick in the air. When I reached Darren's room, I paused at the door. He was lying there, pale but conscious, tubes attached, monitors beeping softly. Chantel sat in the corner, her face drawn and tired. For a moment, I just watched him. My son, older now, frail in a way I had never seen before. Time had humbled him. Maybe life had, too. When he saw me, his eyes widened. "Mom," he said softly, voice barely above a whisper. I smiled, small and warm. "Hi, baby." I walked in and took his hand, careful not to grip too hard. His skin was cold. "You scared me," I said. He laughed weakly. "Scared myself, too." For a few minutes, we talked about nothing. The doctors, the weather, how the grandkids were doing. It felt awkward, like two people relearning a language they once spoke fluently. Then, after a silence that stretched too long, he said, "Mom, I'm sorry." I looked at him, really looked, and saw the boy I once knew beneath the lines of stress and pride. "I know," I said. "You don't have to explain." But he did anyway. The words spilled out. Guilt, regret, shame. "I was so angry when you cut us off," he admitted. "I thought you were punishing me, but now I see I was punishing myself. I made everything about money. I took your kindness for granted. I see it now, Mom. I do." Tears welled up in my eyes, but I didn't let them fall. I squeezed his hand gently. "You don't have to fix the past," I said softly. "Just learn from it." He nodded, eyes closing as if the weight of years finally lifted. Chantel sniffled quietly in the corner, dabbing at her eyes. After a while, the nurse came in, and I stepped outside to give them space. Standing in the hallway, I felt a wave of emotions crash over me. Relief, sorrow, gratitude. I leaned against the wall and let out a long, shaky breath. Healing, I realized, isn't about erasing the pain. It's about walking through it without letting it break you again. Over the next few weeks, I visited Darren often. Not every day, I kept my boundaries, but enough to let him know I cared. We talked more than we had in years. Sometimes we laughed. Sometimes we just sat in silence, comfortable for the first time in forever. One day, as I was leaving, he said, "Mom, when I get out of here, I want to do better. I want to take care of things myself. I mean it this time." And for the first time, I believed him. A few weeks later, he was discharged. The doctor said he'd recover fully if he took care of himself. I offered to cook him a meal once a week, not as a caregiver, but as a mother sharing love without losing herself. The difference was subtle, but it mattered. One Sunday afternoon, he came over with Chantel and the kids. The house was filled with laughter again, cautious but real. Naomi helped me set the table, and Jamal ran around the living room pretending to be a superhero. When we sat down to eat, Darren raised his glass of water and said, "To second chances." I smiled. "And to boundaries," I added, and everyone left. That night, after they left,
I stood at the doorway watching their car disappear down the street. My heart was full, not with the old weight of obligation, but with something lighter. Peace. Not the kind that hides from pain, but the kind that stands beside it and says, "We made it through." Later, as I sat in bed, the moonlight spilling across the floor, I realized that love doesn't always return the way you expect it to. Sometimes it comes back humbler, softer, stripped of entitlement. That's what Darren's apology felt like. Not dramatic, not grand, just honest. And in that honesty, I found closure. Before turning off the light, I opened my journal and wrote, "Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. It means remembering without resentment." Then I smiled to myself, closed the book, and whispered into the quiet room, "I did it, Howard. I really did." For the first time in my life, I didn't just survive my story. I reclaimed it.
Months passed, and life began to find a calm rhythm again. The days no longer felt like a countdown to something painful or unpredictable. For the first time in years, Ruby woke up without anxiety clouding her mornings. She had learned to enjoy simple moments: coffee at sunrise, tending her garden, walks by the lake with Naomi, and the quiet hum of her sewing machine. Freedom wasn't just financial anymore. It was emotional, spiritual, and deeply personal. But one morning, as she sat on her porch sipping tea, a thought struck her. What if other women are still trapped where I once was? That idea lingered all day, soft at first but soon insistent, like a melody she couldn't ignore. That evening, she opened her old laptop and began typing. Her story, her mistakes, her lessons. Words flowed like a confession to the world. She wrote about the day she realized her son's lie, about the painful decision to cut the $80,000 cord, about guilt, liberation, and rediscovery. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest. She titled it, "Freedom Has a Price, and It's Worth Every Penny." She shared it anonymously on a women's forum. A week later, she was stunned. Hundreds of comments, messages from women around the world poured in. Some said her story gave them courage to leave toxic marriages. Others said they finally understood that love and boundaries could coexist. One woman wrote, "You didn't just free yourself, Ruby. You gave us permission to believe we can too." Ruby cried as she read them, her heart swelling with something she hadn't felt in years: purpose. Slowly, she began speaking at local women's groups and community centers. At first, her voice trembled, her palms sweated, but every time she looked out at those faces, some scared, some broken, all searching for hope, she spoke with more strength. "You are not selfish for saving yourself," she would say. "You are brave for choosing peace over pain." Each applause felt like a piece of her soul stitching itself back together. One day after a meeting, a woman approached her, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I was just like you. My son keeps asking for money and I keep giving it because I'm scared he'll hate me if I stop. But today, I think I'm ready to say no." Ruby hugged her tightly. "Then you've already started healing," she whispered. That moment became one of Ruby's proudest, not because she saved someone, but because she showed them they could save themselves. Her talks gained attention. Local radio invited her to speak. Soon after, a journalist wrote an article titled, "The Woman Who Bought Back Her Peace." Calls and messages poured in again from women, mothers, even men who said her courage inspired them to rethink family and money. Ruby didn't seek fame, but it found her anyway, the quiet kind that came with respect and admiration. With the extra income she earned from events, she started a small nonprofit called Second Sunrise, aimed at helping women regain control over their finances and emotional independence. Naomi helped her design a simple website, and Darren, now fully recovered, offered to handle the accounting. The irony wasn't lost on Ruby. The son who once drained her finances was now helping her manage a fund for women's freedom. Life had a funny way of closing circles. During one workshop, as Ruby watched women share stories, laugh, and cry together, she realized something profound.
Pain had not ruined her life. It had redirected it. Every wound had become a window for light to enter. Every loss had carved space for something more meaningful. Later that night, Ruby sat by her window, staring at the moonlit garden. Naomi was asleep upstairs, and the house was peacefully quiet. She thought about Howard, her late husband, and wondered if he'd be proud. "I finally stopped fixing everyone else," she murmured softly. "Now I just try to help them stand." Her phone buzzed with a message from Darren. "Mom, thanks for letting me make things right. I love you." She smiled. It wasn't a grand gesture or a perfect ending. It was human, simple, real. And that was enough. Over time, Ruby became a symbol of resilience in her town. People started calling her the woman who said no to save herself. She didn't correct them. In a world where so many women were told to give endlessly, saying no was an act of revolution. But even as her story spread, Ruby stayed humble. She still shopped at thrift stores, still volunteered at the community kitchen every Friday, still took long walks by the lake with her thoughts. When people thanked her for inspiring them, she always said the same thing. "You already had the power. I just reminded you where to look." As autumn painted the trees gold, Ruby hosted her biggest event yet, a women's retreat by the lakeside, with nearly 100 attendees. Standing before them, microphone in hand, she began her speech the same way she always did. "My name is Ruby Walker, and I once thought money could buy love, but losing $80,000 gave me something far greater, myself." The crowd erupted in applause, some women in tears. For a brief moment, Ruby closed her eyes and felt the sun on her face, the cool breeze against her skin. The freedom she once chased now lived quietly inside her, steady, unshakable, and earned. That evening, as the retreat ended and everyone gathered around a bonfire, Ruby told Naomi, "I used to think the best part of life was raising you all, but maybe the best part was learning to raise myself." Naomi hugged her tightly, whispering, "Mom, you did both." Ruby smiled, gazing at the flickering flames, not as symbols of destruction, but of renewal. The fire that once burned her had now become her light.
The following spring, just as Ruby believed her heart had finally found peace, life decided to test the strength of her newfound freedom. It started with a single letter, pale yellow, handwritten, and slightly smudged as if the sender's hands trembled while writing it. She found it tucked under her front door one morning, the name Marcus penned in familiar, uneven strokes. For a long moment, she just stared at it, the past rushing back like an old ghost that had learned to whisper her name again. Her fingers hesitated before opening it, her heart steady but cautious. Inside were only a few lines. "Mom, I know I hurt you more than anyone ever should. I don't expect forgiveness, but I need your help. Not for money, not for me. Chantel left. She took the kids. I'm trying to keep the house. I've changed, I promise. Please, can we talk?" Ruby sat there for a long while, the paper trembling slightly in her hands. The old version of her, the woman who would drop everything at the sound of Marcus's pain, stirred inside her like an echo of habit. But then she breathed, slow and deep, feeling the quiet confidence that had carried her this far. She whispered softly to herself, "Not every cry for help means I have to bleed again." Still, maternal love was something she couldn't switch off. It wasn't bitterness that held her back now. It was wisdom. She decided to think before reacting, something she never used to do. That night, she prayed, not for Marcus, not for herself, but for clarity. "God, show me how to love without losing myself." The next morning, she called Marcus. His voice was rough, fragile, a man finally stripped of pride. They agreed to meet at a small cafe downtown. When Ruby arrived, she barely recognized him. The confident man in crisp shirts was gone. Before her sat someone older, thinner, eyes heavy with exhaustion and regret. For a moment, her heart ached,
not for the son who had lied, but for the boy he once was. He began talking about Chantel leaving, about losing his job, and about how he finally understood what his mother had done for him. He said he wanted to rebuild, to be a better father, a better man. He even admitted through tears that losing her money was the best thing that ever happened to him. He said, "It forced me to face myself. I had to learn how to stand without leaning on you." Ruby listened quietly, her face calm, her eyes kind but unreadable. When he finished, she said, "Marcus, I'm proud you're trying, but helping doesn't mean taking over again. I can be your mother, not your rescuer." He nodded slowly, the first time she'd seen him truly understand. They spoke for hours about the past, about pain, about second chances. By the end, Ruby felt a soft peace she hadn't expected. Not the peace of forgetting, but of forgiving. Forgiveness, she realized, wasn't something she gave to Marcus. It was something she gave for herself, to set her soul free from resentment. Over the next few weeks, they stayed in touch, not daily, not obsessively, just gently. Marcus began therapy, started working as a mechanic, and sent Ruby photos of him cooking dinner for Jamal and Naomi on weekends. It was progress, not perfection, but it was enough. One evening, he showed up at Ruby's house with a small envelope. "I've been saving," he said nervously. Inside was a check, $10,000. "I can't give back everything, but this is a start. You don't have to take it, but I need to try." Ruby looked at it for a long moment, emotions swirling like soft tides. Then she smiled. "Keep it, baby," she said gently. "Use it to build your life. I've already been paid. In peace." Marcus's eyes filled with tears, and for the first time in years, he hugged her, not out of need, but gratitude. Ruby held him briefly, her heart steady, her love mature. It wasn't the desperate embrace of a mother clinging to her child, but the calm acceptance of two souls finally meeting halfway. Later that night, Ruby sat by her window again, her old ritual. The moonlight poured over her hands, illuminating the faint lines that told the story of her journey, from sacrifice to strength, from giving endlessly to learning how to keep something for herself. She smiled faintly, whispering, This is what healing looks like." As she watched the stars, a memory surfaced. The moment she once transferred her last $6,000 to Marcus, believing she was saving him. She thought of how blind that love had been, but instead of pain, she now felt gratitude. Every mistake had been a lesson, every heartbreak a rebirth. That weekend, Naomi came to visit with her fiancé. They brought laughter, music, and the smell of home-cooked food. Ruby watched them, realizing how the cycle had broken. Naomi no longer saw money as love, she saw love as care, presence, and honesty. The legacy of strength had begun anew. Before bed, Naomi asked, "Grandma, do you ever wish you could go back and change anything?" Ruby thought for a long time. She said softly, "Maybe once. But now I know everything that broke me was just life rearranging me for something better." That night, Ruby slept without dreams, not because her mind was empty, but because her heart was full. She had come full circle, from being the provider everyone depended on to the woman who finally depended on herself. And that, she realized, is the purest kind of freedom there is. By the time summer rolled around again, Ruby's home had become a symbol of peace, not just for her, but for everyone who entered it. The once cluttered shelves filled with old bills and family photos were now lined with plants, books, and candles that smelled of lavender and hope. Her mornings began with gratitude instead of worry. Every corner of her house carried a softness that mirrored her own soul, steady, warm, and unbothered by chaos. On her kitchen wall hung a framed photo, the one taken at the women's retreat by the lake. In it, she stood with Naomi and a circle of smiling women, arms linked, sunlight spilling across their faces. Underneath, she'd written in gold marker, "Freedom isn't found, it's chosen." That sentence had become her mantra, the truth she had fought, cried, and sacrificed to learn. Ruby often thought about how much she had lost. $80,000, years of being used, countless tears. But the more she lived, the more she realized that none of it was truly lost. Each dollar had been the tuition for her freedom, each heartbreak a course in strength. She had bought back her dignity, her peace, and her right to say no. Money could always return. Self-respect, once given away, took a lifetime to reclaim. One afternoon, she sat in her backyard, watching the sky turn orange and pink as Naomi and her fiancé Isaiah helped set up fairy lights for an evening barbecue. Music played softly from a speaker, and laughter floated through the warm air. For the first time, Ruby didn't feel like an outsider in her own family's joy. She felt present, fully, beautifully alive. Isaiah walked over, handing her a glass of lemonade. "Miss Ruby, Naomi says you're the strongest woman she's ever known," he said with an admiring smile. Ruby chuckled. "Well, strength doesn't come for free, darling. It's the most expensive thing you'll ever earn." As the night fell and fireflies blinked across the yard, Ruby shared stories. Not of pain, but of lessons. She spoke about boundaries, about learning to love without losing yourself, about understanding that sometimes the kindest thing you can do for others is to stop letting them take advantage of you. Naomi listened intently, her head resting on Isaiah's shoulder, eyes shining with admiration. Later, after everyone went inside, Ruby stayed on the porch. She looked at the stars and whispered a quiet thank you to the universe, for the heartbreak that taught her wisdom, for the silence that brought her peace, for the loneliness that showed her strength. She thought of her late husband, Earl, and smiled softly. "You always said I was too soft, Earl. Turns out, softness can be a kind of strength too, when you learn when to stop bending." Her phone buzzed on the table, a new message from Marcus. It was a picture of Jamal and Naomi, both smiling, sitting in front of their freshly painted house. The caption read, "New Beginnings." Ruby stared at it for a long time, her heart swelling with quiet pride. She realized that healing didn't mean forgetting, it meant remembering differently. The pain was no longer a wound, it was a scar that reminded her how far she had come. The next morning, she visited the local community center, where her nonprofit, Second Sunrise, had just opened a new counseling room. A plaque hung outside the door, for every woman who thought she was too old, too tired, or too late to start over. Ruby ran her fingers over the words, her throat tightening with emotion. She thought about how this room would soon be filled with women who had stories like hers, women who had given too much and finally wanted to give to themselves. During a meeting later that day, one of the volunteers asked her, "Miss Ruby, how did you find the courage to cut everyone off?" Ruby smiled thoughtfully. "It wasn't courage at first. It was exhaustion. But once you get tired enough of being broken, courage shows up naturally. And when you finally walk away from what drains you, you start to see what was meant for you." Her words hung in the air like a prayer. The women in the room nodded, some with tears in their eyes. Ruby realized that her story wasn't just hers anymore. It belonged to every woman who had ever been told to keep giving, even when she was empty. That evening, as she drove home, she noticed the sky painted with streaks of purple and gold, a quiet reminder that endings could be beautiful too. She turned on the radio, and her favorite gospel song began to play. Without thinking, she sang along, her voice soft but certain, every note carrying the peace she had earned. When she arrived home, she found a small envelope in her mailbox. No name, just a simple thank you card. Inside, in neat handwriting, were the words, "Your story saved my life. I was where you were. Tired, broke, afraid. Because of you, I finally said no. I finally chose me." Ruby pressed the card to her heart, tears sliding down her cheeks. She didn't know who had written it, but it didn't matter. That one line summed up everything she had fought for. She had turned her pain into someone else's hope. That night, as she stood by her window, her favorite place in the house, she thought about the journey behind her. The lies, the betrayal, the loneliness, the courage. Every chapter had led to this, not just freedom, but fulfillment. She no longer saw herself as a victim or even a survivor. She was something more, a builder, a healer, a teacher. The woman who had once been silenced by guilt and dependency had become the author of her own piece. The house was quiet, the world at ease, and Ruby finally understood. Freedom wasn't a moment. It was a lifestyle, a daily choice to never trade your peace for anyone else's comfort again.
The years that followed moved quietly, like a soft hymn playing in the background of a peaceful morning. Ruby was now 76, her hair a beautiful silver halo that framed her calm, knowing eyes. Time had etched gentle lines around her face, not of weariness, but of wisdom, the kind that only comes from having lived, lost, and learned. Her home, once filled with echoes of guilt and duty, now pulsed with life, laughter, and purpose. Every plant she nurtured bloomed wildly, as if they too had taken strength from her transformation. On the morning of her 76th birthday, Ruby woke before sunrise. The house was silent, except for the faint hum of the fridge and the rhythmic tick of the wall clock. She made herself a cup of tea and walked out to the porch, where the world was still wrapped in the golden hush of dawn. The lake glimmered in the distance, and the birds sang softly, as if wishing her peace. She sat in her favorite rocking chair, her blanket draped over her knees, and let the memories of her life drift through her mind like pages turning in an old book. She remembered the woman she used to be, the one who said yes out of fear, who mistook sacrifice for love, who worked endless hours just to keep her family afloat while drowning herself. And then she thought of the woman she had become, strong, balanced, unshakably kind, yet fiercely protective of her peace. She smiled at the contrast. "I guess both versions of me were necessary," she murmured, "one to break and one to rebuild." A car pulled into the driveway, interrupting her thoughts. Naomi stepped out first, her arms full of flowers and a bright smile lighting her face. Behind her came Isaiah and their little daughter, Ruby's great-grandchild, Layla, a curly-haired bundle of energy who ran straight to her with a squeal. "Grandma Ruby!" she cried. Ruby laughed, her heart swelling with warmth as she hugged the little girl tight. Layla's laughter sounded like bells, pure and free. Inside, the family prepared breakfast together. The smell of pancakes, syrup, and laughter filled the house. Ruby watched them move around the kitchen, Naomi at the stove, Isaiah setting plates, Layla humming to herself as she arranged napkins. It was a simple scene, but to Ruby, it felt sacred. This was the life she had fought for, one not built on debt or guilt, but on love that asked for nothing but presence. Later that afternoon, as the sun painted the sky in soft pinks and golds, Naomi handed Ruby a small wrapped box. "It's from all of us," she said. Ruby carefully untied the ribbon and opened it. Inside was a delicate gold necklace with a tiny pendant shaped like a key. On the pendant, engraved in small letters, were the words, "To the woman who unlocked our strength." Tears welled in Ruby's eyes as she traced the engraving with her finger. She looked up at her family, her voice trembling. "You have no idea how much this means to me." Naomi took her hand and said softly, "We do, Grandma. You showed us that real love doesn't come from what you give. It comes from who you become." As evening settled, Ruby sat outside again, watching Layla chase fireflies. Marcus arrived quietly, a bouquet of daisies in his hands. Time had softened him too. He looked healthier, calmer. The restlessness that once clouded his eyes was gone. He hugged his mother gently. "Happy birthday, Mom. Thank you. For everything." Ruby smiled, her eyes glistening.
You already thanked me, Marcus, she said. Every time I see you happy, that's enough. They sat together for a while, saying little. Sometimes silence speaks more truth than words ever can. As darkness fell and the first stars appeared, Ruby closed her eyes and listened to the laughter drifting from inside the house. It was the sound of healing, the music of a family rebuilt, not through money, but through understanding. The years had taken much from her, but they had given her something far greater in return. A new beginning, written not in fear or sacrifice, but in choice. She whispered softly to herself, almost as if speaking to the wind. I once thought losing $80,000 was the end of my world, but that loss was just the price of my freedom, and I'd pay it again 1,000 times over. The wind stirred gently, brushing against her cheeks like an old friend. The stars above shimmered brighter, as if approving her words. In that moment, Ruby understood the full meaning of her journey, that love without boundaries becomes bondage, that giving without balance becomes self-erasure, and that freedom, once earned, must be guarded like the most precious treasure. Later that night, after everyone had gone to bed, Ruby stood in front of the mirror. She saw an old woman, yes, but one radiant with quiet dignity. Her reflection no longer carried regret, it carried gratitude. She reached for the key pendant around her neck and smiled. It wasn't just a gift, it was a symbol. A reminder that she had unlocked her own cage and stepped into the life she truly deserved. Before turning off the light, she wrote one last sentence in her journal, the same one she'd been keeping since the day she said, "Ask your wife's family." Her pen moved slowly but steadily. Freedom is something you don't earn once. It's something you choose every day. And today, I choose it again. She closed the book, exhaled deeply, and looked toward the window, where the moonlight poured across her face. Ruby smiled, calm, content, eternally free. And as the night embraced her in its quiet glow, the world outside seemed to whisper her truth back to her. Sometimes, losing everything is the only way to finally find yourself.